Welcome to the Lauder Institute at the University of Pennsylvania. I'm Jules van Binsbergen, director of the Institute and a finance professor at the Wharton School.
And I'm Jonathan Berk, a finance professor at the Graduate School of Business at Stanford University. This is the All Else Equal podcast.
Welcome back, everybody. Today we're going to talk about, I think, a very exciting topic, Jonathan. We're going to talk about the history of progress. And the reason why we thought it was important to address this topic was that there are many different opinions about how progress is going right now, what we should expect the future to bring, and different perspectives exist on whether or not the end of the world is near or not. And we wanted to place all this anxiety, almost, I would say, into some context and try to get some historical perspective on it from what I think is one of the world-renowned experts on this particular topic.
Well, Jules, taking a step back, I also think there's the sense in people that somehow we are living in unique times and all of our problems are these unique problems. And so we can learn nothing from history. I think that's always a mistake, because I really believe that human beings don't change very much. And the problems we have now are the same problems we had 100,000 years ago, just in a different form. But be that as it may, I think it will be interesting just to find out other civilizations that have reached the pinnacles that we have reached relative-wise, relative to, let's say, 300 years before they reached the pinnacle. What did the world look like and how much have they added? And in those situations, what were those people thinking and how does it relate to our current affairs? That to me is a very interesting question. I don't think many people talk about it.
No, I agree with that completely, Jonathan, because even though, of course, humanity over long stretches of time has made progress, that progress has not been quite that linear. In other words, we've had centuries of setbacks where standards of living have been declining. I think in many ways, our thinking also as an economics profession has very much been dominated by 200 years of the Industrial Revolution, because that is also the period of time, of course, not coincidentally, for which we have the good data. And if you look at the world since 1800, then of course it's an unbelievable success story. If, for example, you look at 1820, in 1820, there were about 1 billion people in the world. According to Our World in Data, it says that 90% of the world was living in extreme poverty, which by today's standard is something like living off of less than $2 a day. If we look at the numbers for extreme poverty today, it's exactly flipped. It went from 90-10 to 10-90, meaning that today 90% is out of extreme poverty and only a little under 10% is living in extreme poverty today. But the question is that 230 years of progress, is that misleading in the sense that we should think that progress is the only possible outcome? Or if we go back, say, 2,000 years or 3,000 years and we start looking at Greek civilizations or Roman civilizations, I think quite an interesting picture emerges. It's definitely possible for whole civilizations to go under.
Jules, you bring up something that I've always been astonished at. Even as recently as my lifetime. So we're not talking 200 years now. We're talking, I'm 62, okay? So 60 years, if you look 60 years ago, half the world was in poverty. And today, less than 10% of the world is in poverty. We've essentially eliminated poverty. And that's an astonishing fact. That's never, ever happened on a global basis. Obviously, in Greek times and in Roman times, there were parts of the world where a lot of people were living, much better than they lived 300 years before, whatever it was. But it never was the case. The entire world was brought out of poverty. That's unprecedented. What's odd, though, is the collective angst. I think if you ask the average affluent person about our times and whether we lived in great times, I don't think many of them would say we do. I think they would come up with many reasons why times are really bad. They would say the world's coming to an end because of environmental reasons. Or they would say people are treated so badly, and they would point to all the bad treatment. Of course, there is bad treatment in the world. In other words, they'd look on the bad side. They'd look at still the ills that we haven't solved and not look at all the unbelievable progress we have done and how good their lives are. And so the question in our mind is, how common is that?
So one thing that I do want to bring up, Jonathan, is of course, in economics, this topic has been discussed a lot, is maybe the sense of well-being that people experience isn't in fact determined by levels. It's determined by changes. It's determined by improvements. Everything that you're used to and that you take for granted and you think is normal is not something that makes you feel secure or safe or happy or, as we say in economics, gives you positive utility. It really seems to be the progress itself. In some ironic way, it's the journey that's more important, where you start seeing things changing around you that seems to reduce this angst that you're talking about. And so once we would end up in a stagnating world where even though we're at absolute high levels, but those high levels either stop growing or start shrinking a bit, also for the young generation, it seems to lead to a lot of psychological angst, as you said.
True, Jules, but what's interesting is we haven't actually had that. For most of the world, it's been up, even now. I mean, so the extent to which, and we may stop growing going forward, but we haven't had that. People are still living better than their parents, and yet in almost all of the world, there's this collective angst that the world is, in some sense, coming to an end. I mean, one of the things that we're taking for granted, and I'm not sure our listeners understand, so we should make it clear, is that the last 200 years has been the great exception. Most of the time, you get no economic growth. And then in a few exceptional times where you get economic growth, ancient Egypt, ancient Rome, Mesopotamia, the Greek city-states, Mesoamerica, China. But most of the time you get no growth. And then there are these times when these incredibly wealthy civilizations just collapse. And then you have 1,000 years where Europeans look back at Roman times as this golden age, and that they lived in poverty when the Romans did not.
And it actually comes back to a topic that we discussed earlier, Jonathan, which is that I do think that once you live in a time in a society that's at its peak, that the collective memory of what the conditions were that made it such and that are required to keep it such are forgotten. We had this example at the corporate level when we talked about the peak of Nokia as a cell phone company, that nobody could imagine at the peak of that company, that company 5 years later would essentially be irrelevant and would have collapsed. Because everybody just assumed that this thing would continue without having to really work at it very hard. And maybe that micro example can be extrapolated to macro examples too, which is that keeping sophisticated societies going and keep them functioning at these high levels requires a lot of investment and a lot of effort. And so the question is whether sort of decadence that you get from these high levels of welfare are contrary to achieving those goals.
So one of the questions you could ask is it necessarily the case that when societies succeed, the people begin to take the success for granted and don't think about what it took to get that success?
Yes.
Is that a necessary condition? Or another way of saying that is, does that mean we're all doomed? Because once you don't do the conditions necessary for success, success doesn't stay.
To say we're doomed, that's a very negative way to say it. A better way to say it is, does this naturally induce cycles across generations?
Yeah. So I think the question is, I mean, these are not questions we could answer, but one thing we could ask is, have we seen it before? And that, to me, I think is an interesting question. I don't think it gets enough play. And it's not an area of our expertise. But we have as a guest today someone who's thought a lot about them, Victor Davis Hanson. Listening to his perspective and his in-depth knowledge of previous civilizations, I think is one of the more interesting things you can do. So let me introduce him. Victor Davis Hanson is Emeritus Professor of Classics at California State University, Fresno, is the Martin and Eli Anderson Senior Fellow in Classics and Military History at the Hoover Institution here at Stanford, and is a visiting professor at Hillsdale College. He was awarded the National Humanities Medal in 2007 by President George W. Bush, and been a commentator on many media outlets, including the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the National Review, and the Washington Times. And I would say is probably one of the world experts in the question we're asking, which is, how did other civilizations, successful simulations, how did they get the success, and what ultimately doomed them? Victor, welcome to the show.
It's great to have you, Victor.
Thank you for having me.
we wanted to talk a bit about the history of progress. And I think that many people take progress for granted and think that things will always just get better over time. But as we know, historically, there are many societies, great societies, that have come to an end. So what makes great societies come to an end?
There was a German scholar in the 19th century said there was, I think, 245 reasons why Rome fell. He went through them all. But usually I think it's successful societies reach a level of complexity in which the knowledge is more refined and more centralized, and it's not disseminated. And then people give up their autonomy, or autarkeia, the Greeks call it. The Mycenaeans, for example, basically from 1800 BC to 1200 were monumental builders. They actually had a system of writing linear A and then linear B, linear A from the Minoans, and they turned it into linear B. And then they vanished. And we don't know really why they vanished, because they were very capable of defending themselves. No one else had the engineering knowledge and the agricultural knowledge. Very centrally located. But when you look at the linear B tablets and you look at the destruction of the citadels, you get the impression that it was almost a Soviet system, that everything was brought up to the palace and then redistributed, and people were losing the ability to think for themselves. So when you mention progress, then writing disappeared in Greece for about 500 years. When it reemerged, it was still Greek, but it was with the Phoenician adapted alphabet, what we know as the Alpha to Omega alphabet. But it was a very different paradigm under the city-states, 1,500 of them. And they were decentralized, and there was a middle class that developed, and people had knowledge about how to produce their own food. And the same thing, I think you can make the argument with Rome, and to the same extent with the Byzantines in the latter 2 centuries, that when you get your society dependent on a particular hierarchy, and that hierarchy is very specialized and has the knowledge to run this specialized society, then the society becomes very, very vulnerable. And I think that's one of my worries about the United States, to be frank, that we have people who do not know how to grow food. They do not know how to, when I was growing up, we all took our cars apart. We take out a carburetor, we fix a clutch. I don't know the first thing about how to fix the car. Specialization historically all results in 2 things: an increase in the standard of living and a greater vulnerability. And it's just a war between those 2 poles. You know, people adapt, but sometimes the Aztecs were very, very specialized. They controlled almost all the knowledge of farming and transportation and the daily lives, religion, everything was scripted from a very small number of people at the center of Tenochtitlan. I think that was one of the things about this election. There were people suggesting that these people in the administrative state that run our lives don't really have the skill or the morality to enjoy such power, and that we should bring it back to the states or the local communities. So that's been a theme throughout history, the concentration of power. The Minoans were the same way. They were decapitated after the earthquake at Knossos. And then the Mycenaeans adopted the same system. They lasted for 700 years. I think you can make the same thing about the Egyptians.
So, Victor, I'm going to play devil's advocate here.
Yeah.
Let me say the following. I don't think there's any society as specialized as the society we live in right now.
Yes.
And I often use in the example the computer chip, which is the center of our society, and the technology to make that computer chip, just the technology of creating a clean room alone, is not something most people would even be capable of doing. It requires a whole coordination of people. So that if we somehow lost that technology, it would be the end of our society. Now, that argument would probably have been made just as effectively about something else maybe 50 years ago. You know, at what point would you decide it's become too specialized and too sensitive?
I think it gets to the point where, hypothetically, if this society that you describe were to cease for 48 hours or be interrupted, would people be able to handle their sewage, their water, their food? Would they be able to survive a week? And I saw that with COVID, with the lockdowns and the original panic. So out here in rural California, I went to 3 stores. You could not buy toilet paper. It was gone. You couldn't really get your car fixed. You couldn't go to a doctor. And there were certain types of people who panicked at that. My wife and I live on a farm, and we were always saying during this, we have a garden and we pump our own water. And I even have a hand pump if the electricity goes out. How long could we exist without the system, power grid and everything? So I think we're getting to the point where we've got millions of people. When we have a blackout, they either riot or they go crazy. And so you get the impression that if that were to continue, would the average citizen be able to protect themselves, feed themselves in a way that I think they could have 30 or 40 years ago? Machinery is much more efficient, much more reliable, but also it's the knowledge of how to create it and maintain it is in such fewer hands.
So one thing that I really like is your argument that there seems to be a trade-off between standard of living and fragility, and that at some point you need to be careful about how you make that trade-off, because if you push it too far, then you may push it over the edge, and that may lead to the end of these societies. Now, some of the examples you mentioned mainly were threats from within or natural threats, but in the world today, we're also moving to a multipolar world versus a unipolar world.
Yes.
So how do you think those forces, the fragility together with the multipolar world, how does that interact, and what should we look out for?
Well, I think it's a historical trend or fact. I don't want to say an absolute truth, but the more affluent and specialized the society, the more reluctant they are to spend on their defense. They feel that psychologically, spiritually, religiously, politically, that they've transcended that need. In Athens, even when Philip II was threatening them, they were arguing whether they should take funds out of the theater fund, the theoric fund that paid people to go watch tragedy. So you can't do that. He's not really a threat. And the same thing in the 3rd century in Rome and the 13th to 14th century in Byzantium. So it becomes very hard for an affluent society that has conquered all these natural obstacles to think there's evil in the world. Human nature hasn't changed. People are still acquisitive. They like to prey on the weak. The strong dictate to the weak. That message, as you can see in the United States and especially Europe, doesn't really resonate. And the idea that Europe is very vulnerable wasn't really brought home to them till Putin went into Ukraine. And then people said, is there anything stopping him from going into Germany? Is there anything stopping him here in the United States? If you look at the readiness of the defense establishment, we're building the wrong weapons. We're building far too few of them, and they're far too expensive each platform. We should be building like we did during World War II, a lot of platforms, a lot of cheap drones, drone ships, drone tanks. I think Neil, our colleague at Stanford, Ferguson, made a good point that historically, when a society's interest on the debt exceeds the capital for defense, I think we're spending about $1.2 trillion to serve our debt each year. That's larger than the $900 billion defense budget. That's a barometer that something's not sustainable. But affluence and leisure seem to be antithetical to military preparedness and deterrence.
Victor, I grew up in South Africa, and growing up in Africa, if you'd said to me as a young man that 50 years later, we would have be close to solving poverty in the world, I would have just looked at you and thought you were mad. And then I would have said, if you achieved that, that would be nirvana. Yet, we're living in nirvana now, and people are under the impression that we're in the worst of all times. Question, is there anything in the historical record where societies have achieved that have reached their apex, and at the time, people felt that, in fact, they were at the worst of times?
Absolutely. I don't know whether you want to call it hypocrisy or irony, but you can make the argument that the greatest period before the Industrial Revolution of material prosperity is what we call the 5 good emperors, that period of Nerva, Trajan, Hadrian, Antonius Pius, and Marcus Aurelius, 100 years, which what Gibbon in his Decline and Fall said was the greatest period of human prosperity in history, including his own 18th century. And yet, when you look at the literature of that period, or even before, maybe even during the Neronian age, it was very prosperous. But if you look at Petronius' Satyricon, or you look at Suetonius' biographies of the 12th Caesar, or Tacitus' Annals, any of those, Catullus' poem, you get the impression that with material progress comes moral regress. It goes back to Hesiod's Works and Days. So I think what you're talking about is the more money and affluence and the more you conquer elemental or existential challenges of disease and food, the more people become self-centered, leisure. There's no longer a struggle or a challenge. And that's a theme throughout literature. And what happens then, you can rationalize morality in a way. It's absolutely true historically that the more affluent a society, the less religious it is or the less transcendent it is. I think what people see is that they conquered the existential challenges and then they ask themselves, morally or spiritually, are people happier? Are they happier than their grandparents? And in this sophisticated, complex society that brought them such lucre. And I think historically, if you look at certain barometers, sexuality, I'll get in trouble for saying this, but if one were to read Petronius' Satyricon, and I've taught it in Latin a number of times, he has a number, it's a novel, but he has a lot of barometers of what he would call luxus, or luxury to the point of decadent. And one of them is an obsession with exotic food. Another one is deprecation of soldiers and military people, making fun of the frontiers. Another is what he would call transvestism or sexual ambiguity. Another one is lack of fertility, or a great discussion about how to abort children. It's kind of a trade-off in that material prosperity brings people, I don't know, they get more self-introspective, or they feel that they've lost something from their ancestors or their parents, even though they're much better off materially. If you talk to a Roman in the 1st century AD, his life is just incomparable to a Roman in 3rd century BC. But he would tell us, I just love to read Virgil or Horace and the great Italian agrarianism of my great-grandfathers. They were yeomen. They were the legions that beat Carthage. They had their own farms. They were independent with their vines and olives and wheat. This is so wonderful. There was not very much slavery at all, if it even existed to any substantial degree. And so I think that's just we're stuck with it. The richer and more prosperous we get, the more that we get ambiguous about it, and our morality becomes more questionable.
Victor, after the fall of the Roman Empire, humanity spent 1,000 years essentially looking to that time as a golden age of knowledge, wealth, and everything. We're seeing the same thing again. Is there a way to avoid this? Can we learn from history? Can we rise above this? Can we avoid the same thing happening to us?
It's much, much more difficult in an affluent and leisured society to instill a moral code or a humility than it is in a less wealthy society to become wealthy. The pathway to get riches, we know now, it's free market capitalism. That's the only system that works. And the less regulation and the less taxation and the more you're entrepreneurial, the wealthier you get. But the other side of the coin, once you get that expression of wealth and your daily life is incontestably improved, can you still have a 2.1 fertility rate? Can you limit divorce to 2 divorces rather than 4? Can you have a moral code where people are not, will they do things that are amoral, but they're still legal? And that's the challenge. And I think in our society, we have all these different movements that are questioning, how do we enjoy this affluence and leisure without losing our souls?
Victor, let me change the subject to something else about our society that I find puzzling. And I wonder if in historical record we saw similar things, which is this existential worry about the end of the world.
Yes.
Look, we could argue about global warming, but global warming will not end the world. It might make our lives difficult, but it's not going to end the world. Yet I would say most people think it's like a world-ending event. They perceive a non-existent existential threat. In history, did similar things happen?
Yeah, I think there's 2 factors that are fertile for that sort of worry about the end of the world. One of them is secularism. So if you believe that you have this physical body and that's it, and there's no soul that can be detached and that crumbles, and you are in an affluent society and everything is good, you say as you get older, I don't have to worry about food, transportation, medicine. I look at 60 as my grandfather did at 30. I'm going to live to be 95 and die in my sleep. But then I'm going to die? It's all going to be gone? And you can see that with societies that have one children. One of the bright spots of that is that they're much more, at least historically, they're much more hesitant to go to war if you only have one child, because that's it. But the other thing is, with this material progress that we've talked about, and I think it's really germane to your point, the people who are pushing this alarmism about global warming, they have controlled and mastered so many things in our lives. You know, Tesla now is a viable electric vehicle, not quite yet there, comparable with the range of a gas, but it's getting there. And there are certain new strategies that may, in our lifetime, make us survive types of cancer. So they think that they're conquering almost every challenge historically of the human species except death. And now you can really see that in this Silicon Valley mega supplements, mega infusions every week, metformin, the diabetic drug will extend you. They have all these ideas to extend their life, but the more successful you are at mastering the age-old challenges, the more arrogant that you are that you're God and not human. That's a very common thing. There's a great line to go back to the novel Petronius. He says, "Sumus homines non di." I'm going to remind you people, we are humans. We are not gods. And so I think people feel they're godlike and they can conquer the ultimate challenge of death. And anything they feel that thwarts that or is a risk to it, oh, we've got to stop global warming because it's going to end these beautiful lives of ours. We have to be utopian on war. There's no such thing as human nature constant. It changes. We can change human nature. We can make people less prejudiced. Some of it is true, but the idea you can alter human nature is a very dangerous concept. But it is a symptom that the more successful an affluent society is, the more paranoid they are about extending the lifespan of everybody. They look to slay dragons that aren't there. And we see it all the time. If you notice, almost every study that comes out from the NIH says 4 carrots a day will increase your lifespan by 3 days, or filling up your gas tank more than twice a week will lessen your lifespan by 2. It's always in the context of this will make you live longer or this will make you live less. And there's almost a paranoia to it.
This may be too reductionist, but you said earlier, if existential threats give people meaning, we conquered many of the existential threats, but now we're short of them. Isn't the optimal response to start inventing them?
I think so. I think that's exactly what Jonathan was getting to, his point, that you have to invent them. And one of the things that, I don't know if you remember when Putin went into the Donbass, John Kerry said, he was Secretary of State, I think at the time under Obama. He said, this can't happen. We're in the 21st century. And what he was saying is that we've so progressed and we're so utopian and humanitarian that we're just not going to allow that. Then I think a couple of conservative senators said, and what are you going to do about it? Are you going to go give him a utopian lecture and shame him? And he's going to feel, oh, I'm so sorry. I broke the 21st century humanitarian protocols. I'll go back and I'll apologize. Or are you going to have to go get somebody from Dayton, Ohio, who grew up kind of poor and he's in the, special forces to deal with Putin?
Well, Victor, thank you so much. This has been a very enlightening conversation.
Very deep.
Well, thank you.
I've learned more in this half an hour than I ever dreamt I would. So thank you very much for coming on the show.
Well, thank you for having me. And Jonathan, Jules, you guys are both widely admired at the Hoover Institution. And so that should encourage people.
Thanks for listening to All Else Equal podcast. Please leave us a review at Apple Podcasts. We love to hear from our listeners. And be sure to catch our next episode by subscribing or following the show wherever you listen to your podcasts. For more information and episodes, visit allelseequalpodcast.com or follow us on LinkedIn. The All Else Equal podcast is a joint production of the Lauder Institute at the University of Pennsylvania and the Graduate School of Business at Stanford University, and is produced by University FM.